Hello, I'm Deborah Sword.
Hi, I'm Tyson Bankert. Welcome, everyone. I have a question for folks that are listening. If they've ever been in a conflict and they realize that the conflict has more to do with the perspective that the other person takes. And so often, many of our conflicts are exactly that. The lens are the particular way in which you've come to understand a conflict has so much to do with our perspective. We've talked about this before in previous episodes about perspective taking and understanding that. And it makes me think about layering that onto our biases. It's the thing that actually contributes to maybe the conflict, but also reinforces our biases that we hold. And so I'm wondering, what kinds of biases show up in conflict, or sorry, that cause conflict for us. Do you have a couple, Deborah, that you are thinking about?
Well, there are a lot. There are four that I talk about a lot. And
Mm,
the reason that they cause conflict, first of all, let me start again. Biases are necessary so that we don't have to rethink what's important to us each and every time.
mm,
So I have a bias towards ice cream and chocolate. So if you're offering me a sweet, I don't have to get paralyzed making a decision.
right.
But other biases get in the way of of our decision making. And the big one is confirmation bias. And we're seeing this a lot now in politics, current events, wars, where you can show the same news clip to people on opposite ends of the polarized conflict. They will each see it, and each of them will interpret through their own bias to confirm what they already believe. So you read the same statistics, you interpret it to support whatever position you already hold. And these pre existing filters make whatever you're hearing fit your beliefs so that we don't get cognitive dissonance or have to change our mental programming. So then we have to ask, well, how do you get around that? The conflict competence for confirmation bias is to challenge your pre-existing beliefs and the assumptions so that you don't get tunnel vision. And Tyson, probably got some thoughts on tunnel vision as well.
I mean, this comes back to some conversation we've had in previous episodes as well about patterns that we see and ways of behavior, right? And I think about confirmation bias as the reinforcing of those patterns. And you aren't maybe willing to have those patterns be broken at any given time, right? You hear something in the news that contradicts the pattern that you've been hearing. Oh, it must be wrong, right? Or someone shares something with you that breaks that pattern. You don't want to hear it, and then so therefore then conflict comes up. And I think when we talk about being competent, it's about, to your point around that pre-existing beliefs, it's about understanding that those patterns can be broken and maybe aren't always true, or maybe you're stuck in those echo chambers for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think that also kind of lends itself to not just sort of what we hear in the news, our particular ways of doing, but also with other people, which lends itself to communication bias, right? So, you're always this way, or you always do this, or that's all I ever hear from you, right? And this idea that narratives that we create for other people, and that is all that we see. And I think that can also be a version of that limited view of somebody, of how they show up in the world. And so that can cause a lot of conflict because we know that we're a lot more dynamic and interesting and expansive people, but when we're always kind of caught in these loops that well, this is how you are, this is how you always communicate, it lends itself to also having that sort of that tunnel vision.
Yeah, that this second one, communication bias, is particularly difficult because so often the person that you're expressing the communication bias with is someone that you're intimate with or a close friend or someone you believe you know them so well that you anticipate what they're going to say, their belief, their response, their position. So you don't listen or you don't listen as deeply. So you don't even realize or notice or accept if they change. You don't, they're growing or taking on different interests and positions, and you half listen, or you don't ask that inquiring question that you would if it was a new friend that you were trying to get to know, or a new love interest where you were excited by everything they had to say. When you know, think you know somebody so well, you don't expect them to change or to surprise you. So the conflict competency for communication bias is to stay curious. If there's someone that you're particularly close to, ask at least one good question a day. Show interest, notice changes, and express appreciation when that friend or loved one does the same for you. Otherwise, you fall into that pattern of half listening or interrupting because you believe you know how they're going to finish the sentence.
Mm-hmm. That that kind of makes me think about maybe the next one about hindsight bias a little bit. Because, it's I it's a situation when someone maybe, it's a breakup or you're fired or someone tells you the thing that's really quite shocking to you and you wonder, wow, okay, things are definitely going to change now, but you see the other person just moving on or creating a new space or new ways of doing without you so quickly. And I think that ultimately what I think sometimes happens is they've been dealing with this conflict for weeks, maybe years, and and you're just catching up to it. And I think hindsight bias is this idea that you look back and go, oh, where were the signs? And oftentimes there are there, but it can leave you with sort of this sense of like of of feeling like you were caught off guard, right? And an unsettling feeling of oh, I want to address the conflict. I want to figure it out. Um, yeah, I'm curious to know some more thoughts from you about like that hindsight bias. Like, what are some things that are sitting with you?
Well, you've identified quite a bit, unpacked quite a bit of it. Um, and yes, then once the shocker hits you that there were signs, then you want to scream, well, why didn't you tell me?
Hmm.
The person kind of looks at you and says, well, I did. You weren't listening.
Right.
Then the fight becomes whether or not you were listening rather than what the real issue is.
Hmm.
So it's how we look at a past decision, whether we treat it as fate or inevitable or avoidable. And a lot of it depends on how we feel about the consequences that we're living with now. So
Right.
we'll look at, was the decision more complicated than I treated it at the time, or was it simpler and I'm overthinking it? It's how we view things at the time that we undertook this course of action is different now because we're looking at the consequences now, looking back. So
Mm.
was it more complicated than we appreciated? Was it simpler than the time we gave to it? And that depends on how we feel about where we are in the present. So the conflict competency is to figure out, are you operating from a place of regret for the decision that created your current situation? Can you accept that your memory is fallible? And so you don't beat up on yourself thinking that you made this bad decision, because at the time you were dealing with the best information you had. You weren't trying to sabotage your future, but no information is perfect. You can never know everything. You had that information and decided that this was the best you could do for you at the time that you made that decision. So cut yourself some slack.
Mm, mm,
Forgive yourself.
mm. Are there any other biases we want to chat about?
Well, there are lots, but the last one that may affect listeners would be groupthink bias.
Mm,
And that happens when you believe you're correct because everybody around you agrees with you. So you're associating with people, or you're reading or listening to, in that echo chamber, as you said, Tyson, people who think like you. Where the conflict comes is when you reject those who don't think like you. So
mm,
then it becomes a conflict for you to associate with those others because you've already put them in a basket full of people like them, not people like me.
mhm, mhm,
So you, if you are going to associate with them, you can't discuss sensitive topics. So you censor yourself, you ghost them, or you exclude friends or colleagues or family members from your circle, even though you care about them. But you just can't be with them because you're in this groupthink mentality. And one of the expressions is when everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks at all. And so that is a problem because groupthink forces you into a binary choice of either having no real, authentic relationship with them, it's very superficial, or it's a conflictual relationship if you see them because you want to talk about what's important to you and they don't agree with you. So you come to depend more and more on your in group, and they're the ones who reinforce that you're correct. So the
right.
more you hang out with them, the more you believe you're right,
Mm,
to the exclusion of the others. So the conflict competency is to be your own devil's advocate. Read one article or listen to one podcast today from someone with a point of view that you disagree with. And ask tough questions like, what if I'm wrong? Or what if the outgroup, those other people I disagree with, what if they have a few good ideas? What would that look like? What would happen if I talk to them from a place of curiosity? Not just what do you believe, but tell me your reasons for believing that. You might find out you have more in common with them than you know.
mm. That exposure is so important to hearing other people's stories. It really helps to break down those walls that can cause us to having conflict. And I also think that groupthink bias uh, encourages us to also not see the people that are in that group, because the reality is there are various wedges and slices of what people think about anything, right? And to be only so content um, with just the status quo potentially of, well, we all are like this, doesn't allow for any movement for people to, as we said earlier, change, right? It reinforces that communication bias. And so I think that being stagnant in not only your relationships, but also this also in those biases really does not help us become the kind of confident people that we know that we should be.
Thank you so much for listening. Tyson, thank you for raising some really good points and
Well,
raising this as a topic. So we hope you'll subscribe, like, share, comment, leave questions, suggest topics, and come back and listen again to the Conflict Owners Manual.
see you all next week.